If you really want to support this type of migration that people really need in order to diversify their income sources and deal with that seasonal famine period, then policymakers have a role to play, which is that they need to invest in better housing for migrants in the city. This is not going to surprise any policymaker who's familiar with rural and urban areas in developing countries.
Welcome to Vox Dev Talks. My name is Tim Phillips. One of the most interesting strands of research on migration in recent years has investigated what happens when rural workers are offered a subsidy to migrate to the city. We've discussed it on Vox Dev Talks once before. But a new study of data from these experiments in Bangladesh might lead us to re-evaluate some of the early conclusions. Mushfiq Mobarak of Yale University is one of the authors of that study. He joins me now. Mushfiq, welcome back to Vox Dev Talks.
Thanks very much for having me again.
First of all, let's talk about these migration patterns in Bangladesh, because these experiments, they take place in the rice-growing areas in Bangladesh during a season that's known as the Monga. Could you describe what the Monga is, what is this season, why it's so important?
Sure. So in any agrarian society, rice-growing areas, there's a season of planting, there's a season of harvest. And in Bangladesh, just like the rest of South Asia, most of the people who are engaged in agriculture are actually landless. So they supply their labor on other people's farms. So during planting, there's demand for their labor, they earn wages. During harvest, there's again demand for their labor, they earn wages. But the period in between, which is generally September to December in Bangladesh, that's when labor demand falls, because generally the economy is just waiting for the crop to grow. And so when labor demand falls, wages fall. And it also, unfortunately, coincides with the period when the price of rice goes up. So this combination of high prices and low wages means that people who are landless face a very difficult period, and often their caloric intake decreases. In extreme cases, it takes the form of a seasonal famine. So that's that Monga season.
These landless labourers, is there any other work they can get at this time to tide them over?
The government has tried to introduce, say, food for work programs, just like, the big NREGA program in India that, your listeners are familiar with. There's also NGOs that might provide some microcredit to help people, tide over that difficult period. Now, one strategy that many people use is migration. So they would try to diversify their income source by moving elsewhere and perhaps go find work in construction or providing transportation services in the city, like doing some kind of semi-skilled or unskilled work in the city during that period.
And there are enough jobs in the city to absorb this migration, are there?
Yeah, generally, yes. It is the case that, if you talk to city dwellers in Bangladesh and places like Dhaka, everybody does notice an influx of more people during that period. And it's easier for, say, construction project foremen to find laborers during that period. So yeah, Bangladesh is blessed with pretty vibrant labor markets in urban areas that absorb many of these migrants regularly.
I see. And so we can say that it would be a good thing if there was more migration in this context, which is why we try to investigate the barriers to this migration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what puzzled me is while about a third of households regularly send a migrant, there are many more landless people who do not. So that was where the research started, that puzzle as to why do more people migrate if indeed this is a sensible strategy for many.
Now, this leads us to the research, which I think you've been connected to for quite a while now. And in these experiments, households were offered a subsidy to migrate. What sort of subsidy was this? How big was it? Who was it offered to?
So we've been trying this since 2008. Right? So this has been going on for a long time, and we've done multiple iterations since then. So the original set of subsidies in 2008 was two-part payment. So first an $8.50 payment, then an additional $3 payment. So equivalent to about $11.50 at the time. And we chose that amount because that was sufficient to cover the round trip bus fare to nearby cities plus a few days of food. So basically the offer was, look, if somebody from this household would like to try out seasonal migration and go in to find work in the city, then we will cover the round trip fare plus insure that travel essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was pretty much the only condition that was applied, which is that if you were to take this money, somebody from the household should try out seasonal migration in search of work. There was no other condition imposed. So I wasn't telling anybody who within the household should go, where they should go, how long they need to go for, anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And how did you select the households that were offered this subsidy?
We first did listing of everybody in the village and identified the landless or near landless households, as well as people who reported suffering from the ill effects of the seasonal deprivation. So we were trying to target the poor that way.
And as a result of this, did you find that more households sent a migrant to the city?
Yes, so there were three main results worth mentioning. The first one is that once you provide the round-trip bus fare, either in the form of zero-interest loan or an outright grant that doesn't need to be paid back, then the migration rate in those villages go up from 35% in the control villages to about 60% in the treatment areas.
Big difference.
Right, so you can get an additional, depending on the treatment, 22 to 25% of people to try this out, right? That's result number one, that people do take up the offer and try it out once the subsidy is offered.
Mm-hmm.
And the second result is that since now we have random variation in migration, more people are leaving, that allows us to estimate the effect of that migration. And you find that if you are induced to travel through the subsidy, then your family consumes about 600 calories per person per day more. So it's only one person moving and the rest of the family remaining behind. So I collected data carefully on what the consumption patterns were at home. And then the third result is that a year later and 3 years later, even absent any further intervention, many of the people who were induced to travel choose to go back on their own. So we observe, say, the difference between treatment and control in terms of migration rates being 35 versus 48% in 3 years after the original treatments in 2011.
So it seems like a very, very powerful intervention. It has changed a lot of things for the better. Initially, in this research, how are you interpreting what's going on here?
Yeah, so what made it challenging from an economics perspective is to explain this behavior in the sense that, look, this, as you just pointed out, the results suggest that this is better in multiple dimensions. You can get people to go. When they go, their family does better, and then they choose to go back on their own. Their equilibrium behavior changes. So that's puzzling. That begs the question, why did we have to run this intervention? If migration is so good, then people should have been going anyway. So that forced us to dig in using economic theory to try and understand what could possibly explain their non-migration absent the intervention, right? And the original set of tools and elements that we had to have in a model to explain this behavior was that people are probably very risk averse, right? The way to think about it is, look, when there's some individual specific uncertainty here that I know that it's possible to travel, but I don't know how well my skills will fare at the destination. I don't know if I'll find a job, if an employer will find my skills valuable and employ me or not, right? And you're extremely poor to begin with. So you're barely surviving. So imagine, somebody comes and offers you a lottery ticket and says that, look, 80% of the time this works out, you find a job. That's kind of the bus ticket that I'm offering. It is a lottery in the sense that there is some uncertainty about whether or not it'll pay off, right? And even if there's an 80% chance of success, and when it does pay off, it pays off big in terms of increasing your family's consumption. In the 20% chance of failure, when people are extremely poor, if they become $10 poorer because they've paid the bus ticket and return home empty-handed, that can be quite devastating. That can explain this kind of behavior, which is that people cannot take advantage of that upside opportunity because they don't have the means to manage the downside risk. They're already at the edge of subsistence, and if they're $10 poorer, there's a risk that somebody falls below subsistence, and that can be too risky and too devastating for the family.
And I guess that when you are used to being that close to the edge, this is how you are going to feel to any kind of risk at all in your life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's in a sense, it's a poverty trap, right?
Yeah.
That there is a nice opportunity with lots of upside potential, but you cannot take advantage of it just because the risk for you is too big. And that itself keeps you poor and keeps you from taking advantage of future upside opportunities as well.
Well, this is a very intuitive explanation. And from what you've told me about the results that you've had, it seems to fit the story that you're observing. What made you think that this was maybe not the full story here?
So I think the biggest issue from an economic theory perspective is that, yes, it is true that it's risky, but it's still only ultimately $8 to $10 bus ticket that we are talking about. And so one thing that we observe in the data, since we've been tracking these households for many, many years, is that there's a lot of volatility in their income, which itself is not surprising. In agrarian areas that are weather dependent, does come with a lot of volatility. Some years rainfall is good and you have a bumper crop, and other years you do poorly, right? Some years you have lots of labor demand because there's a lot of harvest work to be done and wages go up. So what an economic model would tell you is that maybe if there is such volatility, the years that people end up with higher wages, they should store some of the savings away and then save up to like $10 and then convert it into a bus ticket, which pays off with 80% probability, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what makes the whole experience very difficult to interpret fully rationally from the perspective of an economics model. So we've been looking into this much more carefully since then. And I should also say that our research goal since then has been to understand like whether this type of program should be scaled up.
Yes.
So the original trial was done with about 2,000 households. But then there's a question of, okay, look, if migration is indeed such a great opportunity, then why don't we extend this opportunity to 20,000 or 200,000 people? So that's why we've been trying to attack that problem from multiple angles to try and understand what would be the consequence of, say, scaling this up to a few 100,000 people. And so that's forced us to look at these questions again. So we've been looking at various dimensions of the problem. So for example, when you start inducing more and more people to migrate, then you might start affecting the lives of others who live near them and not just the direct beneficiaries. Yeah. So for example, if the beneficiaries are interacting in the labor market with others, like we need to understand what happens when they leave. Is it that the others are worse off or better off? If the beneficiaries are engaged in risk sharing, informal risk sharing with others, we need to understand what happens when they leave. Are the others worse off or better off when their risk sharing partners are leaving? And we also need to understand why this behavior persists for us to design the right type of program. And that's what led to this new paper with David Lagakos and Mike Waugh titled The Welfare Effects of Encouraging Rural to Urban Migration.
And to produce this new paper, did you need to do any more experiments, or are you sitting on a huge amount of data already?
Yeah, so we actually collected some additional data, but not new experiments. So we reinterpret the original experiments using, in some dimensions, a richer macro style model. But to understand that model better, we did have to collect some additional data from the same set of households. And so the questions that we were posing is that there's two ways to think about that original experiment. One way to think about it is that, there's a whole bunch of people who are living in rural areas who would be very, very productive in urban areas. Only if we could get them to move to urban areas, right, which is really the type of place they should be given their skill set, then we would generate a lot of extra productivity that might generate some economic growth. And that's kind of the macro angle to the question. Like, is this a path to poverty reduction and large-scale growth? But another very different interpretation is that, no, actually, the people who are in rural areas generally just need to be in rural areas because that's where their skill set is a good fit for, right? They are agricultural workers, right? It's not that they necessarily have the right skill set to do a lot of high productivity work in urban areas. However, because of the same volatility I was talking about earlier, there might be some years in which, you're stuck in a rural area and it's really difficult and challenging for you to be there. And those years you need to migrate just because you're in a really bad state. So those are two very different interpretations as to why this migration occurs. So one is productivity enhancing and the other one is dealing with very difficult situation in the rural area. So we allow our model to have both of those paths to explain the experiment. And then we calibrate the model to the experimental data to try and understand, okay, which of these explanations is correct. And what we find is it's actually the second one, which is that this is not hugely productivity enhancing, growth inducing migration. This is more that people are sometimes in desperate straits and they need some support, and this type of subsidy provides that support to them.
So can you explain what's in the mind of someone who could potentially migrate and makes that decision in your first interpretation and this new interpretation?
I'd like to connect this back to our earlier discussion as to why people were not migrating to begin with, right? So one of the issues that I did not tackle in my early explanation in our original paper with Garrett Bryan and Shamal Chaudhry, we did not tackle, is the fact that we were thinking about the effects of migration in monetary terms. Like what is the income increase, what is the consumption increase, etc. But it's also the case that migration, even if it increases your income, it comes with, say, family separation, or the migrant having to go live in an urban area, in an urban slum, possibly under very bad living conditions. They're much more unpleasant than being with your family in the rural area where you actually have space to live. And so one other element that we need to bring in is the idea that, look, just because income and consumption increases doesn't mean that there is an equivalent increase in overall welfare once you account for that family separation and these other, let's call them non-monetary aspects of migration, disutility associated with the move. So that's the main element that we add to the new model. And that in one way helps us explain the results much better for the following reason. Earlier on, I said that it was very challenging for economic theory to fully explain this behavior.
Yeah.
Partly because the monetary returns to migration were so high, it's really puzzling to see, okay, why weren't people moving to begin with? But what we now find in this paper is that once you think about this broader concept of utility, inclusive of both income as well as family separation and bad living conditions, etc., the overall welfare returns to migration are actually not as high as the monetary returns narrowly would have you believe. So it kind of helps put less pressure on the people's rationality or irrationality, right? And now it's much more rational in that it's not as good as we thought it was. So that's what we add to the model. And basically what we see is, look, what's going on here is that people, when they get desperate, when the situation is really bad at home, they leave. But it's not like they really, really like and are enthralled by being there, right?
They're not thinking about this as a great opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's that if they could get away with it, they would rather stay in the rural area with their family.
Interesting.
Of course, utility cannot be directly measured because it's unobserved, it's non-monetary. But one of the things we observe is that for the model to make sense of all the data, it must be the case that there was a lot of unmeasured disutility. And here's the way I can give you some intuition as to how we can make that inference right from this data. So as I was saying earlier, a lot of the people who migrate choose to remigrate.
Yes.
Right. So as I said, like it was a 48 versus 35% difference 3 years later. So in other words, about half the people we managed to induce out of the 60, right? Out of the 24 we managed to induce, 12 of them choose to remigrate. So there's like a 50% remigration rate. But I also told you that the success rate was 80%, which was the monetary success rate. So what must be happening here is that even though 80% of people are successful according to my income, consumption, monetary metric, only 50% are returning. That tells you that there must be something we're missing, right? Out of the 80, 50 are returning, 30 are not, and those 30 must be facing some non-monetary disutility. That's how we can make that kind of inference.
When you think about it like that, of course, then this makes a huge difference. Does that make a difference to what policy should be towards these people that we've been encouraging to migrate? Because on the surface, you've been extremely successful with this intervention. Should we be thinking about it in policy terms in a different way as well?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. And my answer is going to have a little nuance to it. Now, it is the case that there are certain periods when people get very desperate. The situation at home is really bad. Like, let's say there's bad rainfall, drought-like conditions, there's no demand for your labor, and you need to move. And those are precisely the people that policymakers should be helping. They're too poor to migrate because it's still very risky, or they don't have the cash to pay for the transport to move, right? But what we learned from this is that mobility is not great from a utility perspective just because there's, either family separation or bad living conditions. So this is what we went and collected new data on precisely because that was an important policy question. Now, if it turns out that migration is viewed negatively by those beneficiaries because of family separation, there's not much that policymakers can do about that because that's an innate feature of migration. Typically, a male adult household head would move to the city to try to find work. He wouldn't bring his children and wife because it would be too expensive for him to have them in the city, right? That would defeat the purpose. And there's nothing much we can do because it's family separation and that's terrible. And like policymakers can't do much about that. However, a slightly different explanation is that the reason why the male worker experienced this disutility is not because of family separation. Maybe it's not so bad if he's just away earning a living for 5-6 weeks of the year. All of us often have to travel for a living as well, right? But what he really dislikes is the bad living conditions in the city. So we go and run what we call discrete choice experiments. We give these same migrants a bunch of different scenarios. Under what conditions would you migrate? Imagine that you had double the income, but a really poor living conditions, or half the income, or a better place to live where you actually have a functioning toilet. Or we say that, look, you could go with double the income, but you would see your family every 4 weeks rather than every 2 weeks, or every 8 weeks rather than every 4 weeks, right? So we give them all these scenarios and we see what options they choose. And what we learned from that exercise is that it's really not that much about family separation. People don't mind being away for a few weeks. However, what they really dislike and are willing to give up a lot of income for is to have better living conditions in the city. So the data clearly point us in that direction. And that goes back to your policy question, which is that if you really want to support this type of migration that people really need in order to diversify their income sources and deal with that manga period, that seasonal famine period, then policymakers have a role to play, which is that they need to invest in better housing for migrants in the city. And this, even though it comes out of this sort of indirectly from these experiments, this is not going to surprise any policymaker who's familiar with rural and urban areas in developing countries. It is the case that these mega cities, which are the engines of growth in poor countries, it's not just Dhaka, it's also Bombay, it's also Madras, it's also Karachi, it's also Nairobi or Dar es Salaam. So these places are the productivity centers of those countries. They are also very, very difficult places to live. All these cities that I just mentioned rank as some of the worst places to live in the Economist Intelligence Unit's annual ranking of places to live. And that is partly due to the fact that they're overcrowded, there isn't sufficient housing. During certain seasons, lots of migrants come in, right? They don't have access to proper sanitation, proper water, proper space. And that's what makes it difficult, not just for those migrants, but for everybody surrounding them. So policymakers do have a role to play, and that role is in developing better housing, water, sanitation, public services that these city residents, some of whom are part-time residents of migrants, what they need.
Not a straightforward thing to do, but a possible thing to do, and very important if you are going to scale up this intervention. So suddenly you have many thousands more migrants coming into this.
Exactly. Yeah. I think another perspective is not just scaling up an experiment that academics ran, but another perspective that governments might think about is not necessarily around an experiment, but thinking about the urbanization patterns they see.
Yes.
Africa, South Asia, these are fast urbanizing places, and that's sensible because the cities are engines of growth. And so policymakers need to pay more attention to the urbanization and why it's occurring. It's occurring because that's where the job opportunities are. And so public services need to be provided to keep pace with that economic growth, income growth that's happening in cities.
It's a fascinating insight, a very powerful one.
I'll just add one more thing for policymakers in mind. And recently I was talking to senior management at the World Bank, and we had this discussion about should policy be thinking about rural development at a very high level? Like, there's a lot of poor people in rural areas who need support. And one way to support them is by doing some kind of rural development. But a different way to support them is to acknowledge the fact that just because they're in rural areas right now suffering, right, doesn't mean that in the long run, that's where they would be. A different approach to development might not be thinking about place-based rural development, but thinking about, okay, how do we build better infrastructure to create more connectivity between those rural areas and those high productivity cities? So this research agenda is also pushing us to think more about this latter strategy of increasing connectivity as opposed to place-based work.
Thank you very much for not being satisfied with your earlier results and going back to the data. I hope that we'll talk about this again, but for now, Mushfiq Mobarak, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
If you want to read the paper, it is called The Welfare Effects of Encouraging Rural-Urban Migration, and the authors, David Lagakos, Mushfiq Mobarak, and Michael Waugh. This has been a VoxDev Talk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to subscribe. You will find us wherever you get your podcasts, and all our past episodes, as well as articles about the papers we feature, are at voxdev.org.